In Germany, sleek modern airplanes are breaking speed records to the cheers of jubilant crowds. They are powered by the latest piston engines rolling out of Daimler's factories. But in the United States, radials are the order of the day. As the rumblings of war draw ever closer, America begins a search for a fighter to soar above the competition. It is a long and winding road, with many unexpected detours along the way. Several such experiments come to the fore. They are the Fighters 3. America. The roaring 20s have given way to tougher, leaner times. From coast to coast, the Great Depression ravages the country. The new science of aviation, born over the muddy ditches of Europe, has fallen on hard times. With the end of the Great War, demobilization and severe budget cuts have brought military aviation to a virtual halt. The government's coffers have been picked clean by extensive social programs. And with the Army and Navy fighting over scarce resources, the nascent Army Air Corps is left with only scraps. Whatever funds it does have are channeled to bomber projects, which are seen as more vital to the defense of the United States than mere pursuit planes. Such thinking is supported by high-ranking officials like Major General Oscar Westover, Chief of the Air Corps. Through the 1920s and 30s, the Air Corps struggles for recognition and funding. In research and development, America lags woefully behind major European powers. Even Germany, officially banned from possessing an air force under the Treaty of Versailles, excels. It is not only funds that are the problem. Factory floor space, equipment to produce modern planes, and skilled engineers to design them are all sorely lacking. Companies are often forced to underwrite the cost of prototypes themselves, with no guarantee that any orders will be placed. A tug-of-war is taking place over the future of the Air Corps, between the forces of innovation and stagnation. Yet slowly, incrementally, progress is made. Fairly modern pursuit aircraft begin to enter service. Notables of the era include the Boeing P-26 Peashooter, the Sikorsky P-35, the P-36 Hawk, and the consolidated PB-2A. As Franklin Roosevelt assumes the presidency in 1933, the brewing conflict in Europe seems small and distant. The Nazi regime is widely tolerated and even admired in certain circles. But in the years that follow, ominous signs begin to appear. All over Europe, fascism is on the rise, and the newly ascended Reich starts testing the limits of its impunity. While some believe that America's two oceans are all the defense she will ever need, others are not so optimistic. Facing the hard reality that American soil may not be immune from attack, Captain Gerald E. Brower calls for the introduction of larger, longer-range aircraft to intercept enemy bombers far from the American mainland. This gives birth to the exotic Aerocuda. It is Bell Aircraft Corporation's first foray into military aviation. Foreshadowing later developments, the Aerocuda is a peculiar pusher design. Its propellers are placed behind the cockpit, nudging the airplane from behind instead of pulling it from the front. In the words of Major Alexander de Seversky, the Aerocuda represents a great engineering achievement. But despite the valiant efforts of Bell and others, the concept is doomed. An aircraft big enough to carry fuel for long-range interception cannot compete with the maneuverability of smaller fighters. It would be hopelessly outmatched by the new crop of European planes entering the stage. What the country's military needs is a modern single-seat fighter plane. Throughout the mid-30s, work forges ahead on new designs. Fast, deadly designs to craft America's air power. In time, 3 aircraft are adopted into the arsenal of the Army Air Forces. The first is Curtiss' P-40 Warhawk, a tough, low-cost fighter. Its lack of a 2-stage supercharger severely limits its performance at high altitudes. So, in addition to a fighter, it is also used in the ground attack role. Next in America's trio is the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Unlike its two peers, the Lightning uses an original 2-engine twin-boom design. The extra power of its second engine puts the Lightning in a class of its own.
It was a little ahead of some of the others, and it was the first, in its class, it was the first airplane that came out with the speed and climb and record and range and whatnot. P-39 came out, but it wasn't good for high altitude export. The P-38 was the first airplane really that used to escort the bombers. It first flew in about 1937, really late 37, maybe 38.
And finally, from Bell, the P-39 Airacobra. The company had cut their teeth on the Airacuda, learning hard lessons from its mistakes. They are to find greater success with this more conventional design. Its one unusual feature is its engine, which is placed behind the cockpit. Pilots of the Airacobra are therefore afforded an added measure of protection from enemy fire.
And they were good airplanes. It was a fast airplane, the P-39 was. But at altitude, it didn't have any supercharger really that operated efficiently. And so it was a low altitude fighter airplane and had a 37 millimeter cannon in the nose, which is a pretty good sized shell. And you'd feel it when you bam, it would back up 10 knots or something.
All three are powered by the nation's finest fighter engine, the Allison V-1710. Though America has adopted the inline engine for use in its fighter fleet, there remains one major fault. The V-1710's fatal flaw is the lack of a supercharger, which severely limits its performance at high altitudes. Because the Army Air Corps never envisioned having to fight a war above 15,000 feet, this was not considered an issue when it was adopted as the standard pursuit engine in 1937. Despite this sole shortcoming, the three fighters go on to make up the staple of America's air fleet. Precious reliability in a quickly darkening world. But that may not be enough for some. While America may be neutral, President Roosevelt believes that it must not also appear weak. The Nazis' rise in Germany has hardly gone unnoticed, and alarm bells start ringing. In November of 1938, he declares that aircraft, not ground forces, are the best deterrents against Hitler's menace, and calls for a massively expanded, strengthened Air Force. After years of marginalization, air power is coming into its own. And with this enhanced status comes the expectation for ever stronger, faster, ever better aircraft. Despite the strong public sentiment against interventionism, the Army Air Corps begins preparing for the conflict it may have to fight, as the world tumbles slowly into war. It is here that the seeds of America's experimental fighter program are laid. In late 1939, the Army Air Corps issues Proposal R-40C, calling for a new generation of American aircraft. This time, there will be no restrictions placed on the manufacturers. All designs will be considered if they can meet the performance specifications.
The Americans around very late 1939, early 1940, put forward this informal specification. We are looking for new fighter planes, super fighters. I mean, maximize speed, maximize agility, maximize firepower, good visibility, easy to build, cheap. I mean, we're only asking for the moon, folks. Give us ideas. And this time we will not throw away unconventional ideas. We will not necessarily accept them, but we won't toss them in the garbage pail at first trials. So a number of ideas were proposed using this unconventional concept. The three that were put in, I would say, production, the three that were chosen for further development using prototypes. You have the P-54, consolidated Vultee, which eventually became Convair, which eventually became General Dynamics. P-54, P-55 Curtiss, P-56 Northrop. All three of them were pushers. Not all three of them were canards. The 54 was pusher with tail surfaces in the back. The 55 was the canard. Vertical surface in the rear, forward elevator in the nose. The 56, the Northrop, was pretty much a flying wing. Very much unconventional. At first they were supposed to be powered by the same engine, Pratt & Whitney. By and large, the Pratt & Whitney equivalent of the Napier Sabre engine. 24-cylinder, flat-H, sleeve valve, liquid-cooled, super-duper, hyper engine. Never put in production. I'm not even sure if they ran one on a test bed. Pratt & Whitney was busy with radial engines. They had experience in radial engines and developing something that was liquid-cooled with sleeve valves. It was sort of the executive that was interested in that might have left around that time too. So by late 1940, that engine was out of the picture. So the three manufacturers were stuck. They had to find new engines.
Curtiss enters the competition with a strange-looking canard plane, the XP-55. Among its many unconventional features are swept wings and a pusher propeller located behind the cockpit. To assess the unconventional design, they build a flying test bed, the CW-24B. It is a scale prototype, with fabric covering a frame of wood and metal piping. To evaluate its aerodynamic properties, extensive testing takes place at the Langley Full-Scale Wind Tunnel in Virginia. Meanwhile, flight tests begin at California's Muroc Airfield. By early 1942, over 150 tests are flown. The Army Air Force liked it well enough to commission 3 prototypes of the final design. Originally intended to use a more powerful Pratt & Whitney engine, delays forced the prototypes back to the reliable Allison V-1710. The 55's peculiar shape earns it an interesting nickname.
It's nicknamed the Ascender, or the Ascender. The question of where you put the accent. Was it backward? Well, it looks as if it's flying backward in a way. They lost the prototype. Difficult control, difficult to handle. The canards have peculiarities of their own. Performance, again, was no great shakes. Again, the first flight took place in the spring of 1943. By that time, as I mentioned, the Americans had Mustangs, Thunderbolts, and Lightnings that were far superior in performance, that were far superior in controllability, that did not require special training for the pilot. Why bother? Never put in production.
And while Curtiss experiments with canards, Northrop is pursuing innovations of its own. Jack Northrop has for years chased his dream of producing a high-lift, low-drag airplane. He is no stranger to unorthodoxy, as his search yields one exotic design after another. Around the same time that R-40C is being initiated, plans are being drawn up at Northrop for a radical testbed design. The Northrop N1M. It is a pure flying wing, the first one to ever take flight in the United States. And while the basic principles are sound, it is too great a leap to attract commercial interest. So when the Army Air Corps circulates its proposal, dangling the carrot of large government orders, the opportunity is simply too good to pass up.
Northrop was interested in flying wings. So they developed this Black Bullet, as it was nicknamed, using a lot of magnesium alloy. So it was quite innovative in that. I do believe even the alloy was welded, which would have been a neat trick. So a very elegant looking machine. Control, because if it was a flying wing, control was a bit tricky. Performance, again, was not exactly spectacular. Also, the P-56 used an air-cooled engine. So you need the fans to keep the engine cool, especially if you try to run the engine on the ground. Keeping the engine cool was difficult.
This engine powers two contra-rotating propellers in the back of the plane. The welding process used to make the airframe is a Northrop innovation, one that is to become industry standard. But during a hop test, the landing gear fails and the plane flips violently. Pilot John Myers barely escapes with his life, but a broken back and ribs stand testament to the dangers of test flying. This incident, as well as a series of cost overruns, security issues, and a lack of interest by the Army Air Force, culminates in Northrop finally abandoning its flying wing fighter. Beating out its two competitors, Vultee XP-54 wins the Army Air Force's competition. The Swoose Goose is the best of the unconventional designs, but it is not without its shortcomings. Constant engine changes delay the construction of two prototypes. From a Pratt & Whitney engine to an unproven Lycoming, to an unbuilt Wright Tornado, and back again. From month to month, more changes are introduced to accommodate ever-shifting requirements.
Nice looking airplane, very elongated but not practical. They chose another hyper engine, Lycoming, I believe, flat H, very powerful. I do believe that aircraft flew in early 1943, so the P-54, not a canard, but rear control surfaces, pusher propeller, huge machine, bomber interceptor, eventually developed for high altitude work, so you need turbo supercharging, which adds to weight complexity, etc. Large machine. To get the pilot on board, well, you need a ladder, it was complicated, so they simply used a seat, could be lowered. The pilot would simply get on board, buckle up, push a button, and the seat would go up. So no sliding canopy, which was nice because the airplane was pressurized. So you didn't have to worry about sliding canopies and pressurization and seals and everything. Sit down in the seat, go up, lock everything up. To eject, well, to leave the airplane in a hurry, seat goes down, you fall off the aircraft. Neat concept. Speed-wise was no great shakes. The Americans had, by 1943, aircraft like the P-38, they had the Lightning, the Thunderbolt, the Mustangs, high-altitude aircraft, good offensive capabilities. A bomber interceptor was not all that necessary. The performance of the aircraft was sort of no great shakes. Complicated, the engine was temperamental, was never put in production. The armament was going to be a neat idea again, but tricky. Cannons, which had a very slow muzzle velocity, so you need to angle them upward a little bit to make sure they would hit the target. Need a special gun sight, so you can imagine yourself in South Pacific, liquid-cooled engine, you have all these gadgets and doohickeys. The airplane was never put in production, was not worth the effort.
Around the same time, a remarkably similar design is taking shape in far-off Sweden. Caught between two warring powers, the government begins preparing for the worst. And to ensure the nation's neutrality, Sweden is eager to cut reliance on foreign armaments. With all its effort and wit, Sweden commits to developing a vibrant aircraft industry virtually overnight. From Saab, the national airplane company, comes an innovative design. A twin-boom pusher propeller, the Saab J-21.
The Swedes had something that was very comparable to the P-54, the J-21. It was again a pusher configuration, control surfaces in the rear, concentrated firepower, good visibility, was fast. It had peculiarities of its own, but they liked it well enough to put it in production, and they actually had a version powered with a jet engine.
Both are twin-boom pusher designs. Both planes first take to the skies in 1943. Around the world, many nations are experimenting with unusual designs, including pushers, canards, and flying wings. But America, unlike Sweden, has a fleet of proven aircraft to fall back on. In the end, the Swoose Goose, like its unorthodox cousins from Northrop and Curtiss, suffers the death of 1,000 cuts. The desired results are never quite achieved.
Neat ideas, but the conventional fighter planes were available, they were mass-produced. Why bother? Had something really spectacular, like performance-wise, appeared, the Americans would have presumably pushed forward, but with those machines they were very much also rans.
America's bold experiment has turned sour. The new crop of fighters fall by the wayside, one by one, as the superiority of conventional designs becomes evident. So in the absence of a revolution, the United States must make do with evolution. Its 3 frontline fighters are holding the line, performing admirably wherever they may find themselves. They roll off the factory line by the thousands. Over time, both men and machines are trained and upgraded to peak performance. They quickly adapt to every situation and every theater. From the deserts of North Africa and the jungles of Burma, the Curtiss Warhawk goes on to earn quite a name for itself as a hard-hitting fighter and attack plane. It is with a fleet of P-40s that Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers Volunteer Air Force fights its heroic campaign in China. American allies, too, put the P-40 to good use, from Canada to New Zealand to the Soviet Union. But as popular as the 40 may be with the Soviets, it is not nearly so popular as the P-39. Under Lend-Lease, many thousands of Airacobras find their way to the icy battlefields of the Eastern Front, accounting for nearly 1/3 of all Western aircraft supplied to the USSR. The Kaprushka, as it becomes known, performs admirably in the pitched battles over the skies of Russia. Its deficiency at higher altitudes is rendered moot, as air combat in the East becomes a series of low-flying turning duels and tank-buster strafing runs. But of all the pre-war fighters, it is the Lightning that best stands the test of time. Unlike its peers, it is fitted with a turbo supercharger, which goes a long way toward fixing the V-1710's limitations. It is eventually used in a wide number of roles, as a heavy fighter, a bomber escort, or even as a bomber itself. Until the advent of the P-47, it remains America's finest single fighter. And yet, something better still is needed. In the wake of R-40C's failure, the Army Air Forces are left searching for a high-speed, high-altitude fighter to rise above the rest. Their salvation is to come from an unlikely source: the coupling of an innovative new American airframe with a battle-tested British engine. Just as the 3 fighters are being built, something is cooking in the offices of North American aviation. A design that will point the way forward. A name that is soon to become synonymous with American air power: the P-51 Mustang. Designed by Edgar Schmid in just over 3 months' time, and initially sold to the British by company president Dutch Kindleberger, the Mustang features a streamlined airframe and NACA-designed laminar flow wings that make it a cut above America's pre-war fighters. Powered by Allison's venerable V-1710, it is pressed into service as the A-36 Apache. But it suffers much the same fate as its peers. Lack of a supercharger means that it quickly loses performance with altitude. Nevertheless, the British and American forces order several hundred to serve as a tactical air support and reconnaissance craft. In North Africa, the Apache joins the Hurricane and Kitty Hawk in stemming the Nazi tide. But under the orders of Sir Wilfrid Freeman, Britain's powerful head of aircraft production, the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine is installed in a prototype Mustang. Its 2-stage supercharger, recently made standard on the Spitfire, solves the problem of high-altitude performance. The result is, simply put, astonishing. With this new power plant, the Mustang truly becomes a fighter without rival. Beside it, America's existing fleet seems to pale in comparison. In time, it proves to be nothing less than one of the war's finest fighters, easily the equal to the Focke-Wulf, the Spitfire, and the Zero. A solid and reliable airframe is coupled with laminar flow wings to produce a truly aerodynamic plane. Cheaper to produce than a P-38 Lightning or a P-47 Thunderbolt, despite being a superior aircraft, the Mustang is a marvel. Even after the war, the assembly lines keep rolling them out. As the Korean War begins, the Mustang proves its usefulness yet again, returning once more to serve in the ground attack role. And soon, everything comes full circle, as the same revolutionary logic that drove the development of the three experimental fighters gives birth to the F-86 Sabre. With its jet engine and swept wings, the Sabre represents a successful implementation of that very same spirit. An embodiment of the ideal that spurred three American manufacturers to put forth their radical designs. The principle that true innovation comes in leaps and bounds. If nothing is wagered, nothing is gained. Not all experiments are destined to succeed, but each milestone along the road contributed irreplaceably to America's long quest for the ultimate fighter.
The P-51 Mustang, the most dominant escort fighter of World War II. It helped blaze a trail from England all the way to Berlin for America's bomber force.
Of course, the Mustang was a revelation. It was a war winner.
Its creation was sparked by a mixture of genius and chance. The Mustang and its two-stage, two-speed supercharged Merlin engine were the end result of years of technological development. From World War I to World War II, each generation of aircraft went ever higher and faster. But the Mustang's marriage with the Merlin might never have happened. National pride delayed the coupling of these two great innovations. But a new deadly German adversary changed everything.
The Focke-Wulf 190, this was really a top-notch fighter aircraft.
With the FW-190 terrorizing the skies of Europe, the British and American forces swallowed their pride and joined together to create the ultimate fighting machine. December 17, 1903. The Wright brothers' aircraft, the Wright 1, successfully takes off, initiating the dawn of aviation. Man had already taken to the skies with gliders and balloons, but this was the first time that an engine had propelled him into the air. The Wright 1's engine was a crude design by today's standards and put out 12 horsepower only. It was an inline engine, meaning that its cylinders, 4 in total, were mounted in a straight line, a layout that would inspire some of the most advanced piston-engined aircraft ever created. Though a simple design, the Wright engine was innovative. It was the first engine to make use of a lightweight cast aluminum crankcase. Every pound counted. With a heavier engine, the Wrights may not have made history that winter's day in North Carolina. Aircraft weight and power would continue to be important to the evolution of flight. World War I was approaching, and the newly formed air forces of the world needed reliable engines with enough power to sustain flight during operations. From France would come a new type of power plant to take the fight into the air, the rotary engine. Rotary engines operated differently than the inline ones used by the Wright brothers. The cylinders were arranged in a radial pattern rather than a line. When the engine was fired up, the crankshaft remained stationary, while the crankcase and cylinders rotated around it. A rotary engine had one giant advantage over the inlines of the era. It was much lighter, and thus gave a pilot better performance during combat or while trying to evade an enemy. However, the rotary engine was not without its shortcomings. It had poor fuel economy, as it was often run on full throttle. It also provided an unpleasant ride. Castor oil was mixed with the fuel mixture for lubrication, with the side effect of heavy fumes, smoke, and an oil shower for pilots. Turns with a rotary-powered aircraft could prove treacherous. As the whole engine rotated, it produced a gyroscopic effect. A turn to the right, at full power and low level, could end with the death of a pilot. Rotary-powered aircraft remained part of Air Force inventories till war's end, but they were gradually supplanted by the inline engine. Inlines based on the same principles as the one found in the original Wright plane kept improving in terms of power and performance. Between the wars and across the Atlantic, a new type of aircraft engine would emerge to dominate American aviation. The U.S. Navy was looking for aircraft to populate its fledgling aircraft carriers. Space on board was extremely limited, but aircraft with inline engines often had lengthy noses. Their engines, built with rows of cylinders, took up too much space on cramped carriers. Rotary engines, though more compact, had too many other weaknesses to be serious contenders for the role. There was, however, a third type of engine. Before the war, there had been limited experimentation with radial engines. At first glance, these appeared to be just like rotary engines. It's only when they are fired up that the difference becomes clear. In a rotary engine, the crankcase and cylinders rotate around the crankshaft. But with a radial engine, the crankshaft rotates while the engine block is static. Radials often weren't as powerful as inline engines, but they were less complicated. They were cooled by air rushing over the engine rather than through a liquid cooling system. This made radials less vulnerable to battle damage, which might rupture the coolant lines. Navy pilots who might have to travel long distances over the ocean to get to a target needed an engine that would be sure to get them home under any circumstance. Most importantly for the Navy, radials were smaller than inline engines, so a greater number of aircraft equipped with them could be stored on board their carriers. The Wright Aeronautical Corporation, a successor to the original Wright Brothers Company, used their aviation expertise to create the first reliable radial engine for the Navy, the J-5 Whirlwind. The J-5 was put on display for the entire world to see when Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic in his Spirit of St. Louis in 1927. His flight solidified the reputation of the J-5 Radial as a dependable power plant. The budding airlines of the world were looking for engines to power their airliners and to bring their passengers across continents and eventually across the globe safely. Reliable radial engines seemed to be the ideal choice. Radials would power many of the principal airliners in the history of civil aviation, from the Ford Trimotor to the Boeing 247 to the Lockheed Model 10 Electra. Both the U.S. Navy and U.S. Army Air Corps would rely heavily on radial engines as they built up their inventories of fighters and other aircraft. In the 1930s, the U.S. had just one inline engine in development, the Allison V-1710, an engine that would one day power some of America's great fighters. At the time, relying on radials seemed a prudent decision, but in the years to come and in the battles ahead, it would leave the U.S. playing catch-up with their allies and enemies in Europe. In Europe in the 1930s, air forces and aircraft manufacturers were looking for speed above all else as they designed the next generation of fighters. Using streamlined designs and powerful V-12 inline engines, They pushed their aircraft to speeds over 350 miles per hour. Their inline engines were not only more powerful, they also helped to create more aerodynamic airframes. Their elongated shapes allowed for more streamlined designs as compared with radials. Inline engines may have been more vulnerable to attack due to their complex liquid cooling systems, but no matter how durable a radial engine is, speed kills in a dogfight. Inline engines were built to provide just that. It was from this European obsession with speed that some of the legendary fighters of World War II were born, including the Supermarine Spitfire, the Hawker Hurricane, and the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Beneath their elegant frames purred ever more powerful inline engines from Rolls-Royce and Daimler-Benz respectively. In the middle of 1940, the pilots of the RAF tested their mettle and the endurance of their fighting machines in some of the most spectacular air battles of World War II. Vice-Fuhrer Göring had promised to destroy the RAF and thus facilitate the invasion of Britain. Göring had at his disposal an armada of medium bombers protected by a deadly fighter force. The result of the Battle of Britain during those few vital months of 1940 is well known. There was a heavy toll in fighters and pilots on both sides. British and German engineers tried to squeeze every ounce of power from their engines. Any tiny advantage could be the difference between life and death. With Britain and her industry under direct attack, she looked to her old colony more than ever to provide her with desperately needed aircraft. Even before the Battle of Britain, the British Purchasing Commission had already been shopping for additional aircraft. The US's initial offer of fighters was not well suited for the high-altitude dogfights taking place over Europe. This was partially due to the American engines available. The US had concentrated on radial engine production instead of inline engines like the ones so popular in European fighters. They did have the Allison engine, the V1710. Like the British Rolls-Royce Merlin, it was a 12-cylinder inline engine, but it had a complex turbocharger often difficult to fit into an aircraft. To boost power in the thin air at high altitudes, the Allison engine used the heat of its exhaust to power a turbine and thereby increase the airflow and power. One American aircraft, the Lockheed P-38, had the extra space needed to house the turbocharger. It was a big twin-engined aircraft to begin with and had space in its tail booms for the extra equipment. But given the size of the P-38, it wouldn't have fared well against nimble single-engine German fighters in a dogfight. America had other smaller fighters powered by the Allison engine, the P-39 Airacobra and the Curtiss P-40 Warhawk. In both cases, their manufacturers failed to include Allison's turbocharger. The P-39 had an innovative layout, with its engine situated mid-fuselage, behind the pilot. It was designed to house both the Allison engine and the turbocharger. However, a scoop built into the left side of the fuselage to cool the turbocharger was deemed too aerodynamically expensive. Both the scoop and the turbocharger were eliminated from the production design. This change crippled the Aerocobra's ability to fight at high altitudes. In the case of the P-40 Warhawk, a rugged single-engine airplane, the turbocharger was excluded from the design from the get-go. This limited its optimal altitude to just 15,000 feet, and thus relegated the aircraft to ground attack work. The British Purchasing Commission was still interested in the Warhawk, even with its limitations. They saw it as more of an Army support aircraft. However, the Curtiss factory was running at capacity and could not fulfill the order. With no suitable aircraft readily available for purchase, the Brits would turn to North American aircraft. The British Purchasing Commission proposed that North American build the Warhawk under license from Curtiss. But NAA President Dutch Kindleberger had a bolder plan. He guaranteed that he could create an even better airplane, using the same Allison engine, in less time than it would take for him to retool for Warhawk production. The Brits said yes, and the end result was an airplane that may well have changed the outcome of the Second World War in Europe. Back in Europe, Germany was looking for an aircraft to augment the Bf-109. In the Battle of Britain, the Bf-109 and Spitfire were closely matched. But the Bf-109 lacked the range to be highly effective in its escort role over Britain in the summer of 1940. The Luftwaffe had a twin-engined escort, the Bf-110. It had the range to be an excellent escort, but it lacked the maneuverability to defend itself or its charge in a dogfight. It also used two Daimler-Benz 605 engines, making it an expensive sitting duck for British interceptors. Looking for a quick solution to their escort dilemma, the Luftwaffe even considered having the 110s tow 109s into battle to conserve fuel. But in the long run, using two aircraft to perform the role of a single fighter was an even more wasteful solution. What the Luftwaffe needed was a dedicated single-engine aircraft to fill in for the Bf-109 on longer-range missions, and ideally something to give them a decided advantage over the British fighters of the time. However, the Luftwaffe wanted to have its cake and eat it too. They wanted a new fighter, but they didn't want to sacrifice any of the precious 605 engines meant for the Bf-109. To the consternation of the Luftwaffe, most of the new submissions for fighter designs from German industry were to be built around this very same engine. To solve Germany's escort woes, one man, Kurt Tank, Focke-Wulf's legendary designer and test pilot, did what was almost unthinkable at the time. Since the start of the war, British and German designers had relied upon powerful 12-cylinder inline engines to power their fighters. Tank dared to build Germany's next fighter around a bomber's radial engine. The air-cooled BMW 801 radial engine had plenty of power and had proven reliable in the Ju-88 and Do-217. But radials in a fighter were a rare sight in Europe. It was difficult to build as aerodynamic a fuselage to house them in as when constructing one for a slender inline engine. Though an unconventional design track, Tank saw two reasons for encouragement. Firstly, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics in the U.S. had already done research on improving airflow around radial engines. Over time, they had developed the NACA cowl, which at least helped to reduce drag. This was a simple ring which fitted snugly around the cylinders of a radial engine. It not only made the engine more aerodynamic, it also improved cooling. Secondly, Tank observed that the US and Japanese navies were employing several modern carrier aircraft, all with radial engines. Aircraft like the F-4F Hellcat and the Japanese A-6M Zero. The lightweight Zero had been almost unstoppable in the early part of the Pacific War. Tank had continued to explore ways of improving his new radial-engined aircraft and reducing the drag effect, although some say his greatest task was selling the radial idea to the ministry. If that was the case, the bureaucrats must have been quickly won over by Kurt Tank's first prototypes. Given the designation the Focke-Wulf 190, and unofficially known as the Butcher Bird, the Luftwaffe's latest fighter was rushed into production. Fortunately for the Allies, the FW-190 arrived after the close of the Battle of Britain. In the summer of 1941, 5 Mark V Spitfires flying over the south coast spotted several radial engine fighters in German markings. At first glance, they were mistaken for US-built Republic Lancers. It was a deadly case of mistaken identity. The aircraft were, in reality, early model FW-190s. The Spitfire pilots who survived the ensuing battle lived to tell just how quickly their comrades had been lost. But Britain's greatest loss that day was not pilots or planes. The battle marked the day Britain lost air superiority to the Luftwaffe. The RAF had to do something, and fast. All eyes looked to Rolls-Royce, manufacturer of the Merlin engine, the power plant of the Spitfire, Hurricane, and so many of Britain's great planes. Although the company had the next-generation engine, the 12-cylinder Griffin, in development, it was well over a year away, more than enough time for Britain to lose the war. Earlier, there had been some thought given to modifying a few Merlin engines for experimental high-altitude work to be executed by a Wellington bomber. It was little more than an idea at the time, but in Britain's hour of desperate need, Rolls-Royce engineers worked night and day to test the concept. Merlin engines were already supercharged. An air compressor mechanically attached to the rotating camshaft increased the airflow to the engine, allowing it to burn more fuel and to boost performance. Rolls-Royce engineers had theorized that adding a second supercharger could give the engine even more punch during high-altitude work. Might a two-stage supercharger help the RAF reclaim air supremacy? The end result of the Rolls-Royce experiments was breathtaking. It was almost as if the two-stage, two-speed Merlin was an entirely different engine, when in fact it was just a modification. When the double supercharged aircraft, dubbed the Spitfire Mark IX, finally arrived in June of 1942, the RAF had a rare opportunity to test it directly against a captured FW-190. The test results were far different than the day a group of unlucky RAF pilots ran into a flock of butcherbirds. The two aircraft were virtual equals in terms of performance. Captain Eric Brown, who had flown a captured FW-190, had a chance to test the new Spitfire 9 against the German aircraft in live combat.
I'd flown the 190 quite a bit, so I wasn't too frightened. I reckoned I knew what that aircraft could do, and I knew what my Spit could do, so I thought, well, I can handle this guy. Hoping he was somebody just out of training school. But no, I picked somebody who really knew what he was up to. And we had, I would say, a toing and froing over France. But neither could get a draw bead on the other. We finally realized, as both of us, we run out of fuel. We waggled our wings at each other and departed. And I realized this was really a top-notch fighter aircraft.
The RAF had leveled the playing field with the Luftwaffe, at least for the time being. But what the RAF really needed was an aircraft to give them the upper hand. The new Merlin's greatest contribution to the war was still to come, when it was mated with an extraordinary aircraft of American design. Back in the U.S., North American Aircraft had continued to work on a Warhawk substitute, which met the specifications laid out by the British Purchasing Commission. They had specified that the airplane be powered by an Allison engine, that it cost less than $40,000, and that it be armed with 4 .303-inch machine guns. North American answered with the P-51 Mustang. It featured an advanced laminar flow wing for good aerodynamic efficiency, and a wide gate undercarriage for safer landing. Pleasing to the eye and to fly, although mainly at lower altitudes, the new arrival quickly gained respect from pilots and ground crews alike. There were some concerns about how the Mustang would fare should it be forced to ditch while crossing the channel. During a water landing, its air scoop, located beneath the fuselage, might flood the aircraft or cause it to overturn. Water tank tests at Saunders Row were initiated to perfect the techniques for ditching the aircraft. Around the same time that the RAF was getting the Spitfire Mark IX ready for combat, and the FW-190 was dominating the skies, Rolls-Royce test pilot Ronald Hawker was tasked with the mission of evaluating all aircraft powered by non-Rolls-Royce engines. He was thoroughly impressed with the P-51A, save for its poor performance at high altitude. Like the P-40 Warhawk, it had an Allison engine and no turbocharger. Hawker pondered how the aircraft might perform with the new Merlin engine. The results on paper were phenomenal. According to Rolls-Royce's calculations, with a Merlin power plant, the Mustang would not only outclass any American aircraft, but even new Spitfires using the same engine. Oddly, Hawker had to push for the mating of the Merlin 61 and the Mustang, even though the double supercharged P-51 would have outclassed the FW-190 as well. Hawker finally arranged for the marriage of the two great inventions, and test trials confirmed his hunch. The Mustang was a war winner. The main challenge was to produce enough aircraft and engines to reclaim the skies of Europe. North American would tweak the Mustang design to accommodate the Merlin 61 engine. It was a much more powerful engine, so the original P-51A airframe had to be reinforced. As well, the three-bladed prop was exchanged for one with four blades. The addition of plumbing for drop tanks might have seemed a small change, but it would have a great impact on the air battles to come. Packard took up manufacture of the Merlin 61 engines in the US. They were designated the V1650s. Packard had arranged a licensing agreement with Rolls-Royce earlier in the war. Ford was originally slated to build American-made Merlins and seemed a perfect choice due to the company's industrial might, but Henry Ford was adamant that his company build defensive weapons only. North American's double supercharged aircraft, the P-51B and P-51C, first took flight in the spring and summer of 1943. Air Vice Marshal Paddy Harbison recalls when the Mustangs first arrived at his Spitfire squadron.
Well, of course, the Mustang was a revelation. It was a much more comfortable airplane than the Spitfire was. And I have heard people talk about the relative merits of both. They were both war winners. The Spitfire was built as an interceptor. It could out-turn a Mustang and it could out-climb it, but it didn't have the legs the Mustang had. And of course, if you can't get to where the fight is, you're not too effective.
As P-51 started to arrive in Europe, the war was changing, and the Mustang was the perfect aircraft for the time. The US was taking the war to Germany. They were bombing the German war industry out of business. The only problem was their bombers were being shredded by speedy German interceptors. The US had hinged their hopes on the ability of their bombers to defend themselves by maintaining a tight box formation. When this strategy failed, they were in dire need of an escort fighter. The P-38 Lightning was simply not agile enough to take on the role. Then there was the P-47 Thunderbolt. It was an awesome radial engine fighter, more than capable of taking care of itself in battle. But it had two major flaws. It was expensive, and it lacked the range to take the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The P-51Bs and Cs arrived just in time. They had been designed to carry drop tanks, and with the addition of a fuel tank behind the pilots, they had more than enough fuel to escort American bombers to Hitler's lair. The Mustang proved more than a match for Germany's FW-190 and Me-109. Slowly, American bombers closed in around Berlin. Suddenly, the Germans found themselves playing catch-up. Kurt Tank's FW-190 with a radial engine found it difficult at higher altitudes where the bombers roamed. Tank swapped its radial engine for an inline. The long-nosed aircraft was nicknamed the Dora.
The Focke-Wulf Dora, the later Dora, was a magnificent fighter with an engine change, not really any structural changes other than those to accommodate the engine. But what it meant was, here was an airplane that could keep up with the hunt as the years of the war progressed. So from 1942 right up to the end of the war, the Focke-Wulf 190 was in the top grade of fighter or fighter bomber.
The P-51 Mustang also continued to evolve as mechanics and engineers incorporated changes based on the feedback of pilots who had tested the plane in battle. Its canopy went through several permutations. The British swapped the original one for a sliding Malcolm hood, similar to a Spitfire's for improved visibility. The P-51D, the definitive version of the Mustang, had a bubble canopy, which offered 360 degrees of clear view. North American also upgraded the D's firepower. It had 650 caliber machine guns compared to 4 in earlier models, and it had solved the problem of gun jamming during hard turns. The fuel tank situated behind the pilot may have increased range, but it created other issues. The plane had poor directional stability when the tank was full. To counter this problem, engineers added a small dorsal fin in the D model. These and other improvements would help the Mustang blaze a path to Berlin for America's bombers. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was quoted as saying, "When I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the jig was up." When the European war had come to a close, the battle still raged in the Pacific. The Mustang was the best escort available, but even with its incredible range, it could not accompany an aircraft like the B-29 Superfortress on extended bombing missions over Japan. The expanses of ocean were too large. The engineers at North American struggled with the problem of stretching the Mustang's range. Their solution was a Zwilling or twin Mustang. By fusing 2 Mustangs together, they hoped to dramatically increase the range of the Mustang while retaining its excellent dogfighting abilities. The new Mustang, the F-82, had an incredible range, 2,000 miles. Though the prototypes were powered by Packard-built Merlin engines, the U.S. Army Air Corps was adamant that the production version be totally American-made. Unfortunately for the F-82, without Merlin engines, it was not the same aircraft. When fitted with the Allison V-1710-100, its speed dropped and high-altitude performance suffered. It was one of the few cases of a prototype outperforming the production model of an aircraft. By the time the F-82 was ready, Japan had surrendered, and the war was over. After the war, the P-51 continued to serve, while other piston engine fighters of the era went quietly into retirement. Though it was the dawn of the jet age, there was still a place for the Mustang in a variety of roles. Colonel Ray O. Roberts flew the Mustang during its second life.
At that time I was flying what they call the F6, which is a P-51 with cameras, also had guns, and you could have the bombing and gunnery capability. And we participated in a post-hostilities mapping program. We mapped, revised all the Japanese maps, photographed, did aerial photography in Japan and Korea.
When the Korean War arrived, Mustangs which had been mothballed for long-term storage were suddenly being shipped across the Pacific on carriers. Unable to compete with the next generation of jet fighters for the dogfighter role, Mustangs returned to where they started. In Korea, Mustangs made excellent ground attack aircraft. They didn't have the speed of jets, but they had the endurance to make it from Japan to Korea on bombing runs. In Korea, the F-82 also had an opportunity to taste combat for the first time. F-82s flew strike, escort, and night fighter missions. The marriage of the P-51 Mustang and the Merlin 61 engine produced incredible results. It provided the Allies with an effective escort to pound the last nails into Germany's coffin. Perhaps the most amazing thing about the P-51's stellar career is that it might never have happened. If the Merlin and Mustang had never been mated at the suggestion of Hawker at Rolls-Royce, the P-51 might have had a humdrum career as a reliable ground attack aircraft, rather than an elite dogfighter. It arrived at the right time and the right place in history, just when the Allies needed an escort fighter. The P-51 was the end result of years of aircraft and engine development. Though jet-powered aircraft would supplant it, the impact of the Mustang and Merlin in military history cannot be unwritten or denied.
Aviation The art of aeronautics began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's skunkworks Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.